Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined again. Actually, we had a good conversation about a little over 2 years ago by Scott Lincicome, trade scholar and practitioner, but broader thinker on things economic and globalized and globalizing as well, and senior fellow at the Cato Institute, lawyer in private practice. Scott, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Good to be back. If only virtually.
Yes, well, next time in person. But
Exactly.
You've been working at home virtually for quite a while, right? As a lawyer at a big firm. I mean,
Yeah, I've been living in the cloud for. I've been the trendsetter. None of this.
if
is
you
new.
may
The
say
only-
so yourself, right?
Right. The only new thing is having my entire family at home too, which does present new challenges.
Yeah. We should have. Eventually, we'll end up with a reversal of what was the practice for most of the last 200 years, which is you'll work at home and you'll kick the family out of the. Well, that is what will happen. The kids will go back to
Exactly.
school and you'll be home. Yeah.
Exactly. And you need a lock for your office door. That's the number one rule for pandemic working from home.
That seems contrary to the spirit of Cato, open borders, free access, but that's okay. Everyone's got their limits, right?
That's right.
Even the most libertarian among us. So, I thought you wrote a terrific piece a couple of months ago on the vaccine, the development of the vaccine, and sort of lessons to be learned from that. It's an unusual task that the private sector and government faced there in January, February, beginning in almost exactly a year ago, really, January of 2020. So say a word about lessons to be learned from the vaccine, and then we can go into some of the details and
Sure.
the role of the private sector, different parts of the private sector of government. Do that, and we'll talk about that for a while, because I think that is very interesting, and then talk also about trade and where we stand on that. So the vaccine, what do you learn from the vaccine development?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a wonderful story of the hidden benefits of globalization. When we talk about trade, and when you hear President Biden yesterday talking about trade and globalization, you always hear
I
of
should
it.
say that we're talking in late January, so yes.
Right. Yes. So when you hear the political dialogue around trade, it is typically about cheap consumer goods, so the proverbial cheap T-shirt, and manufacturing jobs, and that is 90% of your political dialogue, and rarely do you actually do I think the public consider really the broader aspects of globalization and all of these hidden benefits and the ways that globalization, that free trade or the relatively free flow of capital and ideas and labor, services, goods, all of those things really work together secretly hidden to make our lives better. And in this case, the vaccines is a perfect example. Starting from the very beginning, from the release of the genome sequence in China by a Chinese researcher and an Australian colleague, that was then picked up by Moderna researchers and folks at BioNTech, the other big mRNA research firm in Germany. So they got a hold of this and they immediately set out to determine how their mRNA vaccine could fight the virus. And when you then look at the research teams, these were...
And they had developed an mRNA vaccine on their own for other purposes, or just because it was an important scientific advance? Or
Well, I think that both teams had mRNA vaccines or for the flu, and they were working on other things. But yeah, I think that the primary drive in the very early stages was scientific, right? Since this was January, it was really before the pandemic had become the pandemic. And so they were looking at this, I think, from a kind of academic perspective. But the Moderna team apparently developed the initial vaccine in a matter of days. BioNTech was just a little bit longer. Now, if you look at those research teams, it reads like a roster of the United Nations, right? Just all sorts of Americans, Germans, Turks, you name it, French, all sorts of immigrants, all working together on these research teams, utilizing research from other immigrants that were working on mRNA vaccines before. Then when you move past that, you see that, Moderna itself is a product of global capital markets. It was a small startup funded by a VC firm that then got backing from the Gates Foundation and the rest. And then, of course, BioNTech was similar in that it accessed global capital markets through its immigrant owners as well to get off the ground in the first place. And then, of course, BioNTech then realized it had something. And at this point in February, March, the pandemic was really starting to rage. And so BioNTech had a previous collaboration with Pfizer and the, of course, American multinational headed by another immigrant who has tons of manufacturing and regulatory experience. So BioNTech realized they needed to get a heavy hitter in the game. They teamed up with Pfizer, and Pfizer used...
And just to be clear, BioNTech is a German
German
firm,
firm, right?
Yeah.
And again, just borderless collaboration.
Right.
They got together and started working on the actual manufacture and production of the vaccine in March. By April, Pfizer had decided they were all in, and they were going to sink about $2 billion of their own money. Again, money that they have because they have a market capitalization of tens of billions of dollars and can fund this. And they set out to manufacture the vaccine using existing production facilities in the United States and in Belgium, using inputs from all over the world, and again, all of this amazing technology. And then Moderna had smaller facilities, and they needed help. So they outsourced the manufacturing to a Swiss firm named Lonza. And Lonza had production facilities in Switzerland and in the United States. And again, they were tapping global supply chains for the inputs they needed to produce these vaccines. And all of this, importantly, from the libertarian side of things, was really happening without a lot of government involvement at this point. So Operation Warp Speed, as it's now known, really only got off the ground in May, and these big purchase contracts that Operation Warp Speed undertook to buy the vaccine, and now we're distributing it through that program. Those were only in July. So all of this kind of permissionless innovation, collaboration, all of it across borders with all these different people and so forth, is such a wonderful story of globalization in the broadest sense. And I think it really provides just a fantastic real-world example of the intangible benefits of this collaboration. Surely we could have probably made an all-American vaccine at some point. Contrary to popular myth, we have a lot of manufacturing capacity in the United States, and of course we have a rip-roaring pharmaceutical industry. But it was the breakneck speed and success was truly a story of global cooperation. Cooperation that, of course, couldn't have happened had we had massive barriers to trade, investment, immigration, and the rest. And so it's really that kind of relatively free flow that allowed this all to happen so quickly and miraculously have a vaccine, 9 months after the after the Pfizer BioNTech partnership was announced, and something that they predicted in April they would have it done by December. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing. I'm interested. Well, there are many questions, some of them having to do with the appropriate role for government and also the downsides, I suppose, of globalization, people getting off planes from, China in January and bringing us the virus and so forth. But I'm interested to let me start with this, the sort of, it seems like a good case study of why you want to have small startups and massive, big established firms. And I think in America and politics, there are people who root for one or the other to some degree and sort of disparage a little bit the big the corporate players who are sort of corporatist and like government handouts and lobby a lot and are bureaucratic, and then there and people love the small startups, or vice versa. People who say, let's grow up. The big firms do all this important stuff, and the startups start whatever little things. So say a word about that kind of collaboration, and what does that tell us about which we should encourage more, capital markets, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it shows that there's clearly a role for both, and for the ones in the medium size in between, right? And that it's very hard for us to know, which we'll need at which moment. and why it's very good to have these kind of small firms betting the farm on these very risky, novel technologies. But on the other hand, having the very big established guys who have the manufacturing facilities, have the knowledge and experience, and armies of lawyers and accountants and the rest who can navigate the real world and the regulatory sphere, and be able to kind of and then work together. Those companies can then work together to produce, whether it's vaccines or other products and services and the rest. And like you said, it's a pretty great thing that we have global capital markets as well that can fund these ideas and can take these risks, and then of course reward the risks with profits. I mean, personally, and again, this is almost cliche libertarian talk, but I'm hoping that whoever developed these vaccines is very, very rich. I think, of course, they deserve to be, saving millions of lives and trillions of dollars in economic output. I think it's a wonderful thing. I hopefully that they will be very much rewarded for this, not merely put on magazine covers, but handsomely rewarded as well. I think that synergy between small business and large business is something we see in a lot of contexts. Again, let's leave vaccines out of it for a second. I mean, you have tons of examples of whether it's Amazon and Etsy providing a platform for, small business or home craft makers and that kind of stuff, or for technology companies in general providing a platform for restaurants and the rest. I mean, there's clearly, I think, a role for both in society, and it is, as you note, a bit frustrating when you hear politicians, railing against the big and praising the small when we get benefits from both.
So let's talk about some of the obvious maybe qualifications or pushback, and some of which maybe is legitimate and some not, to the sort of happy free market globalization, free trade, immigration story, which I'm basically in agreement with. But so, what about the downsides of globalization? Someone getting off a plane in China to, bringing the virus to us in January. I mean, were we a little too dogmatically invested in free travel and so forth? And also, what about the threat to supply chains if you have a government like China's that maybe doesn't want to let those chains operate freely?
Sure. And so, I think there's a nugget of truth in that, had we banned all travel, we possibly could have contained the virus. But I think that the reality is that by the time we were banning travel, the cat was out of the bag. And that you really would have to just simply have no travel overall, because you're never going to be able to pinpoint the moment at which, that the virus first escaped Wuhan and entered the United States, particularly given when it happened, that, it hit during the Chinese Golden Week, their New Year's celebrations, when all the Chinese travel. It's really bad timing in that regard. And so then, to attempt to block it all would be very difficult. And so, you get to the point where you're talking about blocking modernity, not really a travel ban. And then when you look at the actual, literature on travel bans, we find that they don't work very well because of exactly that by the time the travel ban is enacted, again, the cat's out of the bag. So, but look, there's no doubt that being an open economy entails risks. There's no decent trade economist or wonk who talks about these issues would say that, look, the free flow of goods and services and people has no downsides, right? The legitimate argument is that the benefits so tremendously outweigh the downsides that it's a no-brainer in terms of policy, and that there are things that we can do. For example, you mentioned China and supply chains. There are things that
say a word about that, including going forward, as people worry whether it's in the defense industry or pharmaceuticals or other things, that we are dependent on supply chains that have, in theory, I suppose, various choke points that could be cut off by unfriendly actors.
Yeah, and I think that there is a role for government policy in that regard. But the first thing we need to do when it comes to China or any other any other situation where there's the potential for shutting down trade and immigration and student visas and all those sorts of things, is really get a handle on what the problem is and the scope of it. Because you mentioned pharmaceuticals, for example. There's a lot of hysteria about Chinese pharmaceuticals, and yet the data we have are not nearly as terrifying as what you might hear. There was a stat floating around for a while that 90% of all of our generic drugs come from China, and it turns out that was a stat that had, like a game of telephone tag, had started out as one thing and then floated through the ether, and the next thing you know, 5 levels later, it's 90% of all of our generic drugs. So it's first really important to get a handle on where the choke points really are, and to the government's credit, they, as part of the CARES Act, have actually commissioned a study to kind of map some of these potential supply chain choke points. But in terms of what the government can do, there are a lot better options out there than autarky or trying to renationalize everything. The most obvious option, I think, is stockpiling. To the extent that the United States doesn't have, for example, massive industry making surgical masks, which are very, very cheap. And in normal times, we don't even use a lot of them. And, right now, of course, the demand is outrageous. So instead of building a massive surgical mask industry, you can just stockpile surgical masks. They don't go bad. When you have a pandemic, then there you go. Beyond that, though, the key to supply chain risk mitigation is diversity of supply. Yeah. So, you look at something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, and that agreement was in large part designed to create a counterbalance to China in the Asia-Pacific region, and to provide countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, which, by the way, Malaysia makes a lot of rubber gloves. We could have used a little extra trade with them. But TPP was designed to create a diversity of that wasn't or isn't present in existing U.S. trade policies. So, in other words, basically saying we should be preferring imports from Vietnam, Malaysia, other countries that have a similar manufacturing capacity in terms of level of development as to China, instead of China. So there's a lot of role for that. And quite frankly, private actors in response to the pandemic, private companies are very much looking at supply chain diversity, looking at maybe scaling back on the lean inventory systems they applied. It was very popular over the last decade or two that you wanted to have zero inventory. Well, now they're thinking maybe that wasn't the best idea. And so, multinational companies are rethinking a lot of this right now. So the role for government there, in my opinion, should be to create more opportunities for that diversity through agreements like the TPP, and then again, just have emergency stockpiles in case of disaster, as opposed to trying to rejigger and rewire kind of fundamental comparative advantage macroeconomic things that not only are very costly and inefficient, but quite frankly breed all sorts of unintended consequences. Whether it's political cronyism and corruption, or denying capital, I think, to other worthwhile endeavors. A great example, I think, is Kodak. The Trump administration, because of the pandemic and because of this supposed pharmaceutical weakness, decided to give Kodak an $800 million taxpayer loan through the Defense Production Act. Now, for all sorts of non-economic reasons, this deal has turned into a debacle related to stock trading. And, I think some people out there have probably heard about this. But what it also did was Kodak's share price went through the roof, and Kodak's share price is still elevated. So instead of having capital markets and having investors invest in, say, Fujifilm down the road, which also makes these generic drugs generic drug inputs, or there are other pharmaceutical input companies in the United States. We do make some of this stuff. They instead went speculating into Kodak because it had implicit government backing. And so that's the type of stuff that really worries me about when we try to start playing a government venture capitalist and creating all sorts of distortions, seen and unseen. That creates a lot of problems.
And that is this kind of classic, not just libertarian, but just classic liberal argument against too much government intervention in the economy, that it has all kinds of other consequences, including political ones of kind of corporate capitalism and favoritism and corruption, that you can not entirely, but avoid more easily with a more rules-based, picking winners and losers. We used to complain about that a lot in the Obama stimulus package, I think. And
exactly.
Solyndra became famous there for about 6 months or a year, but I suppose the Kodak thing is an example of something similar from the Trump administration.
Right, and it again doesn't rule out a role for government, whether it is in terms of, like you said, creating kind of a systematic, kind of rules-based system, liberalizing trade with certain trading partners, giving them preferential access and the rest, and of course providing money. Right, I think one of the things that Operation Warp Speed arguably did do well is just simply as these advanced purchase contracts to say, look, we will buy whatever vaccine you can get through the regulatory apparatus, and we're going to streamline that regulatory system for you. And so here's billions of dollars that we're ready to pay for your vaccine if you can produce it. And that's, I think, you could say is a good place for government to be, defraying the risk of any sort of upfront investment. And of course, they have the printing presses, so that can play a role.
And stopping a pandemic is a public good, and
exactly.
There's sort of a classic argument for government expenditure.
Oh yeah, public health. I mean, even I can't say the most radical libertarians, but even crazy libertarians like me will say that, look, public health is a perfectly legitimate area for government to be involved. And again, but it's how government is involved. We don't want them saying, aha, we're going to give Kodak money. It's instead just saying, we'll give money to anybody who can produce a viable vaccine. And there's a big difference in that in terms of the incentives that creates.
And how about the basic science side of it? One hears a lot, and it seems reasonable that, like the genome, we're talking about the whole way in which we develop these vaccines is different from previous vaccines because of progress in understanding, I take it, the human genome, which in turn seems to be partly at least due to some government expenditures on basic science. And
and the mRNA technology that was developed was also developed through NIH funding. So and that again, gets to where is there a role for government? Well, basic funding for scientific research. So not picking winners and losers, not trying to figure out what's the next big thing, but instead saying, here's money, go find the next big thing. There's a really big difference between this kind of ends-focused government planning and government kind of seeding, just saying, go, you're very smart. We want individuals to collaborate. We don't care where you're from. We don't care that, if you're going to be making it in America. We just want you to focus on the science. Here's the money. And of course, we have fantastic research institutions outside of the NIH that are great at this. And again, they do it through a lot of multinational collaboration. I mean, global health is probably the area where there's the most of that. But it also exists in manufacturing and technology, high tech and the rest. And that's where I think government really gets into problems. When we have Buy American rules for PPE, for example, that's where the waste, the kind of corruption and all those bad things tend to pop up. And it's important to note, when the government was really under the gun, when they really needed a vaccine, they didn't tell Pfizer, oh no, it has to be made in America. In fact, I've had the misfortune of reading through that contract. And I can tell you that there's the entire section on Pfizer's manufacturing plan is excerpted from any of the conditions of the deal. So in other words, Pfizer was just telling the government, hey, this is what we're going to do, but the government had no control over it. And it's a really nice example, again, of when push comes to shove, we stop worrying about making in America and we start worrying about just get the vaccine done and get needles in arms.
I'm curious, leaving maybe Trump aside and the kind of idiosyncrasies of his management or mismanagement of the pandemic, what conclusions do you come to about the overall way our government works? I mean, is it slightly better than you expected, slightly worse in terms of FDA, CDC, the kind of bureaucracy, the agility or lack thereof, the accountability or lack thereof? I'm just curious as a sort of case study in public policy and kind of governance.
Well, I think Warp Speed overall had a lot of the right ideas in terms of trying to streamline the regulatory review process. One of the really great things they did was they said, you know what, we're going to help you with regulatory approvals in parallel instead of sequentially. So typically you have to develop a vaccine or develop a drug and then test it and then manufacture it and then distribute it. Instead, Warp Speed basically said, we're going to do all of those things in parallel, and we're going to help you with the regulatory side of that as well. And that, I think, is is good, and it's given me some optimism. Hopefully, that can be a model going forward. That said, there unfortunately are some lessons that haven't been learned, and I do worry. And there are some signs that, look, the CDC in general seems to have been caught flat-footed.
Didn't they not do a good job in the early months? It seems like
exactly.
They decided for some arbitrary reason, or maybe it didn't seem arbitrary to them, of course, that they would do a better job on testing than
and that's where things really, I think, are not so good. That when you look at the testing regime, we still don't have a widespread at-home test, which is crazy. They've developed them. We don't have those.
And why not? That does seem. I've been obsessed with the testing thing, and that seems like they messed it up at the very beginning, and they've consistently, if I could say, not been aggressive on that for some reason. And I don't think that's entirely a Trump thing. I mean, that's...
No, this seems far more about kind of institutional bureaucracy, that the CDC and FDA really decided that this was their turf and they were going to handle it. And at this point, you wonder if there even is enough economic incentive for new players to get into the game. How much longer are these tests really going to even be valuable? So I think part of it may be that we kind of missed our window on developing a lot of these, but they certainly were at the very beginning. There were a lot of tests, and of course, part of the problem with the bureaucracy is risk aversion. So they really did not want the bad stories of bad tests. They did not, and because of that, they shut it all down. And that leaves us, where we are right now with testing, which is still, pretty shoddy, again, given how long we are into this. I think the other area that they really seem to be stuck in this kind of old mindset is on the vaccines and on allowing for human challenge trials. So this is essentially the idea that individuals can volunteer. They can say, you know what, you do your normal regulatory approval process, because even with the streamlined approach, the FDA and CDC, they're still using kind of your standard, what's called emergency use authorization approach to therapeutics and to vaccines. And they could have and should have, I think, allowed individuals to simply volunteer. That for, once it's gotten past the very basic testing and safety, they should say, okay, if you want it, come get it. And that allows a dramatic acceleration in not just testing, but assuming the vaccine is pretty good, proliferation of the vaccines. And, because right now we have at least two other vaccine candidates, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, that have been produced and are just sitting around in factories. And that strikes me as, again, they're sticking to this old regulatory framework, which I understand why you want to keep that framework for public confidence and the rest. People don't want to be forced to have an unlicensed vaccine, or you show up at the doctor's office, that's what you get, fine. But the refusal to allow for a parallel track strikes me as a pretty big failure. And that again kind of sticks into the mindset of kind of just very siloed standard kind of thinking, which in a crisis you'd hope would be a bit more abandoned. And then I think the other thing is we look at early on in the process. So really like December, January, more than a year ago, and this is a kind of standard libertarian critique, I think, that the CDC had really and HHS in general had really lost a lot of its focus on pandemics and global health, and were instead devoting a lot of resources to other things. I mean, Fauci himself and the CDC were going after vaping. That was the big thing. In November, December last year, there was a big CDC push on vaping. Well, hey guys, maybe we can ease back on the CDC looking at things like that, and instead keep laser focused on what really, really matters, which are things, again, like pandemics. And so I would hope, again, going forward, that we might have a rethink of how we spend our money at these agencies, because contrary to the popular belief, libertarians do not run Washington. We have not strangled the HHS and the CDC and the NIH. Their budgets have actually increased pretty steadily over the last couple of decades. But the problem is, if you look at HHS funding, very little of it is actually devoted to things like the NIH and CDC and FDA, and a lot of it goes to these other initiatives. And that, I think, is where we've really kind of lost focus and could stand to kind of refocus.
And before we get to trade, which we've touched on already with the TPP, how much of a sense do you have that either party or major parts of either political party or political movement are interested in the kind of reforming of government agenda that you've kind of suggested would be there to make it much more effective in dealing with these things, and also learning some of the lessons of the vaccine in general? Has that permeated through a little bit, that maybe we shouldn't be so glib about, talking about attacking globalization, and that maybe we should pause for a minute and think, well, how exactly are we getting these vaccines that we're all so desperate to get now?
I wish I could be more confident that it's broken through, or optimistic, but I don't really think it has. Unfortunately, you have there is just such a political incentive to take credit for the vaccines, whether it's Mike Pence out there saying that this was all the Trump administration, all made in America, right? And I think that, the incentive for Biden to take credit as well will be massive. And so it'll be very, I think, difficult for at least at the kind of political leadership level for there to be broader lessons learned about, hey, maybe global collaboration and the rest is a good thing. Now, maybe, behind the scenes they get it, but in terms of the rhetoric, I don't have much hope for an improvement.
Shouldn't these big companies like Pfizer, with their massive lobbying arms, be able to tell senators and congressmen who, represent Pfizer districts and states with Pfizer plants and distributors and employees, hey, we kind of need this global supply chain, or we kind of need this trade arrangement or whatever?
Yeah, and maybe there will be an improvement. Because, of course, big multinationals have been talking about whether it's high-skill immigration or, global trade agreements and protectionism and tariffs. They've been talking about these things in Washington especially the last 4 years, but for a long time. And maybe now that will give them a little more leverage. I mean, I certainly know that Big Pharma is very pleased with how this has gone in terms of helping their image and helping restore helping get them a little bit on the public's good graces. And so I think you're right that in terms of providing that sort of example, it could help a little bit.
Yeah, that would be, and small businesses could remind people that they need to buy things from other people as well. The testing thing, I think there might still be enough of a market, and I know someone actually who's involved in one of the startup companies there, and they're very bullish. But it is astonishing that we've just accepted in a way that, it'd be too hard to have these instant tests, when that seems like the science on that is just unproblematic, I think.
No,
and public health benefits are pretty unproblematic too.
And from what I've read, a lot of it again goes back to just massive risk aversion at the CDC and FDA that they want tests that are 95% positive or better and 95% accurate or better, and that level of accuracy is just extremely, extremely difficult for an at-home test. Yeah. Now, any economist will tell you you don't need 95% accuracy, right? That
not
even
for
a
public
test,
health reasons. Yeah.
Right. That in terms of just kind of reopening the economy and all these things, that lower accuracy tests are still quite good. You know, if you still can get something 80% of the time, you're knocking out a lot of potential positives that could go in the public and spread the virus. And yet,
plus false positives and false negatives are very different from the point of view of reopening schools or the economy.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. And so, unfortunately, that type of thinking really doesn't seem to have permeated or beaten the bureaucracy. It's still kind of demanding this very rigorous standard, which in normal times I get. But again, in the middle of a pandemic and a national emergency, you'd hope that we act like it's an emergency.
I mean, I'm surprised. I'm sort of struck how many people in public health seem to have learned. Maybe they didn't learn the lessons of economics. Maybe that's just what public health, as a discipline, to its credit, has understands that it's not an individual doctor dealing with an individual patient, where of course you want the highest degree of accuracy, and you're willing to sacrifice some time in terms of the get a result in 5 days instead of 25 minutes, and expense too. But of course, public health is such a different field. I kind of wonder if some of the lessons of that couldn't be useful in general, because it is in a funny way, I don't know if it's exactly a market-oriented field, but it does try to think through the broader implications of policies.
Right.
And so you don't get the kind of, well, how dare you even think about a test that isn't 100% positive? What if I went to the doctor and got a false positive? That would be very inconvenient. And public health sort of says, wait a second, if you want to open a school and you could dump 30 of these tests in one vat, which is the expensive part, as I understand it, and find out they're all negative quite reliably, you can get the economy going much faster.
Exactly. And I think the other issue is that it seems that a lot of our public health officials also are trying to second guess human psychology. We saw this in the don't use masks kerfuffle, which, has really had some bad repercussions. But even more recently with vaccine distribution and the rest, they seem to be trying to figure out, well, what can we tell the American people? What can the American people handle? But not, of course, thinking about, well, what happens when we change our guidance and that kind of thing. And so it's unfortunate that a little clearer thinking in those areas hasn't broken through.
And it does seem to be, just one last thing on this, we'll get to trade, but that there's a sort of best being the enemy of the good problem and this is, years and years ago in grad school, I remember this famous article, maybe it's not so famous anymore, by, what was his name, Herbert Simon, I think, on satisficing, and how, in a way, economics in theory is always about optimizing, but in the real world, companies satisfice, but in the real world, public policies probably should too. And if you have too complicated guidelines for the vaccines, you end up with squabbles and distortions. And I'm sorry, we can't give it to you because you're. And in a funny way, you just wonder whether they had almost, not literally thrown it open. They probably should still have basic age guidelines in a couple of categories. But much simpler would have been better, I should think.
Yeah, and not to go down a total rabbit hole, but if you look at what a place like West Virginia has done.
Yeah, that's a kind of interesting. We'll talk about that for a minute, because it is kind of a bizarre example, I think.
It's fascinating. So West Virginia realized early on they had very serious logistical problems, being West Virginia, right? A lot of small towns.
No offense to our West Virginia viewers who are.
No. Look, they did amazingly. It worked out great. But so very early on in the process, they realized that they were going to have to take a very different approach to vaccine distribution, that they could not simply rely on hospitals and public health centers. They had to very much decentralize it and use independent pharmacies and the rest. And then also, and I don't know the reason for this, they said to heck with the federal guidelines. And they really streamlined the approach. They just created a couple groups. They treated it basically like an airline boarding situation. Okay, group 1, you go first, but okay, group 2, you can start going with group 1 and group 3 and the rest. And the result has been nothing short of miraculous. I mean, they've used, as of yesterday, 106% of the first doses they've been given by the government. How do you do that? Well,
Yeah,
because they found extra doses in the vials, remember? So they have actually used more than their full lot. They've also even done 50% or more than 50% of the second doses they've been given. So they are just crushing it in terms of vaccine distribution. And again, by really throwing away the government rule book with phase 1A and phase 1B and all these restrictions, and just doing a very open, kind of fluid approach, utilizing a very decentralized, these independent pharmacies and the rest. And sure, there was government involvement. The National Guard, they used the National Guard for distribution, in large part, again, because you're dealing with small country roads and some difficult to reach areas. But regardless, I mean, it has been a fantastic success. And then you contrast that with a place like North Carolina here, or I just read about Virginia today, where the rules are so strict that you see the results. And the results are that you're only less than 50% of doses that have been given in Virginia have actually been put into arms. And you hear the governor of West Virginia, he says, look, we need to get needles in arms because they understand that a vaccinated person is better than a dose sitting on the shelf, even if it isn't a priority person, because, of course, vaccinated people protect other people too. And it seems that, other states just really haven't gotten that message. And they're so worried or obsessed with these rules and these phases that I think the politics of it that they've it's really been a mess in terms of rollout.
Yeah, no, that seems unfortunate, but it does seem like that's itself a public policy lesson people should study, of both the virtues of a certain kind of simplicity, a certain decentralization. I don't know. I guess they have to be kept very cold, and so maybe you couldn't do it through the local Walgreens and CVS's, but I'm not so sure. I mean, it seems a little crazy to me that we can get more people. I know the flu vaccine is different; it's been around forever and all that, but millions of, really hundreds of millions, I guess, at this point, people go get the vaccine without even thinking about it there, and somehow this thing has become a huge bureaucratic headache with younger people, helping their parents and grandparents navigate websites and so forth. It seems a little.
Look, I'm with you. I do think there are specific logistical challenges. There is a supply crunch. I mean, Pfizer and Moderna can only crank out so much vaccine, and there are raw materials issues and issues with vials and syringes, and we get all that. But there should always be shortage. We shouldn't have extra doses, should not be sitting around at this point. And I think you're right that a much simpler approach, and even one, like you said, utilizing existing infrastructure, probably would have been better. Because, look, Pfizer created a cold box distribution system in just a few weeks because they realized this thing had to be stored at -90 or whatever. So they created this kind of makeshift styrofoam box with a bunch of dry ice and a GPS chip. And they said, okay, that's it. So I don't think it would be difficult for either Pfizer or another global logistics company, Amazon, I don't know, but somebody to come up with a way to get smaller amounts distributed pretty easily and done in a very decentralized way.
This is sort of what middlemen do, right? And this is why you want to have middlemen, of which Amazon in a way is the massive middleman. But
exactly.
There are many smaller companies that could do this regionally and locally. And
and it really does seem like we're reinventing the wheel a lot. I mean, I saw this fantastic little story yesterday that in South Carolina, they called in Chick-fil-A to handle the vaccine drive-through. Right. And they apparently got the wait times down from an hour to 15 minutes. And this is because, of course, private companies doing all of those things that we look down upon, right? The cheap T-shirts, fast food, all these. Well, you know what? Those guys are masters at getting things done quickly and efficiently, getting stuff from point A to point B, people from point A to point B. And to just disregard all of that knowledge, world-beating knowledge, seems to me to be be a really unwise decision, and one that we apparently are now relearning, right? We're pulling in Walmart, we're pulling in Starbucks, Chick-fil-A, Amazon might be helping. I struggle to see why they weren't called in July instead of now in late January.
I mean, I guess it would be ironic if the Biden administration, and I'll make sure that, I'm sure they watch conversations anyway, but I'll make sure to get this one to some key players there, that it'd be funny if a Democratic administration is the one that relearns these lessons of, hey, you know what, the private sector knows how to do a lot of these things, and if we incentivize them a little bit, or they'll do it for the vaccine the way they do it, as you say, for fast food or for T-shirts or for all the things Amazon delivers, right? I mean, yeah. Final point, I keep saying we'll get to trade, but this is so interesting. What about both parties? I mean, again, are they in the broader question of, the limits of government planning, the virtues of globalization? Do you feel like we're a little better off than we were a couple of years ago on that, or?
I do. I think we're better off than we were a few years ago, but I still think we're not in a great place. And the reasons for that are very frustrating, quite frankly, because it seems that the political elite in the country have embraced this populist or this narrative that we must be more populist. We must reach out to the Trump voter in the diner or whatever. And regardless of the actual polling and economics and the rest, that this is just kind of a political imperative. And you see this in the Democratic Party, I think, more than the Republican Party. Right now, if the polls are to be believed, 80% of Democrats are wishy-washy free traders. In other words, they like free trade and globalization. They like open markets. They certainly like immigration. And yet you hear the rhetoric from the Biden camp in the first couple days of the presidency, granted, but during the campaign in particular, very economic populist. You listen to the thinkers and on the center left, and they all have adopted this assumption that they must play to this economic populism, that regardless, again, of the facts, the polls, the economics, they must play to it. And that strikes me as a frustrating thing, given, again, the experience we've had, not just with the vaccines, but with the Trump tariffs and all sorts of other things. That strikes me, again, very, very frustrating. And then on the right, look, I think it's impossible to deny that Trump has molded a large segment of the Republican base and a lot of the Republican elite into, if not his image, that kind of more economic populist image. But again, you listen to a lot of Republican elites, Hill staffers, politicians, and again, there's just this skepticism of globalization, of markets, not just, and of capitalism and all of these things, this need for industrial policy and the rest, typically couched in the need to counter China and other things, but still there that I don't think really has much basis in fact, or again in the political side of things, but it is what it is.
It's funny. It'd be funny if the public, were less interested in fake populism than the elites, which does seem to be the case. If someone here in Fairfax County, Virginia, where I live, I think if a Democrat took on the teachers' unions, given that there's been a total fiasco in the Fairfax County public schools, but made clear that he or she were liberal on a million other issues and wanted to spend more on education. You could take a lot of liberal views. I think it would be popular, including with quite left-wing Democrats, actually. Who, so I think you're right. Both parties have kind of talked themselves into a certain political lesson of the Trump years that I really wonder if it's sensible.
I'm with you. And you think of, for example, manufacturing jobs, I think is another good example. There's not a lot of evidence these days that a manufacturing job is this imperative, that boosting manufacturing jobs, not only because wages in services like warehousing and the rest have really caught up and are doing really well now, but also because there's not a lot of young people who really want to go into manufacturing. And if you were to listen to the elites in both parties, we really have to focus on bringing back manufacturing jobs again, as there is this bottom-up demand for working in the mills, which really doesn't seem to exist.
So let's talk about trade for a few minutes. Sure. I think with Trump, we had the first president, really in modern times almost, right, since World War II, who's kind of explicitly a skeptic about, we haven't had pure free trade presidents, but they've all been more or less in favor of the global trading regime moving towards freer trade and fewer barriers, and at least with allies. Sometimes people make foreign policy distinctions on that, but both parties really, even when the parties themselves were less pro-free trade, the presidents, Clinton, Obama, to a considerable degree, were pro-free trade. So Trump wasn't. How much difference did his 4 years make in reality in terms of how much trading we're doing, of how globalized and open or closed we are? And where do you think we go from, what lessons do we learn, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, so I think the starting point is that Trump really did do some damage. In the first is, I think, institutionally, he showed very well, unfortunately, that the law gives the president essentially unlimited authority to impose tariffs or other trade restrictions without any congressional input. You look at the national security tariffs on steel and aluminum. You look at the China tariffs, both, which were actually, the steel and aluminum tariffs were under one part of U.S. law. China tariffs were under another. What you realize is that these statutes are written in such a way that they granted the president so much discretion as to determine what's a national security threat, determine what's an unfair trading practice in the case of China, and then so much discretion as to what measures to apply, what trade measures to apply, that the president can do basically whatever he wants. And I think that the big question mark for Biden will be, does he take advantage of that newfound discretion? Or does he try to pull it back?
Does he support congressional attempts even to be a little stricter on what an emergency is and what a national security and consideration is, and so forth?
Yeah, and that I don't know. I think he's going to have a really hard time resisting the urge to use these statutes to pursue Democratic Party objectives, particularly on climate. For example, a big debate right now is on the use of what we just call carbon tariffs. The idea is you impose a duty, tax, whatever you want to call it, on imports from countries that don't have climate mitigation regimes, either a carbon tax or a cap and trade or something like that. So can he say, well, climate change is a national security threat and I need to impose these carbon tariffs? Some left of center intellectuals have said, yes, he can and he should. So will he resist that temptation? I don't know. And so in terms, again, of Trump's legacy, I think that's actually a pretty big one. In terms of the basic economics of it, not as much. You look at the tariffs certainly have changed trade flows a bit. They certainly have caused harm for domestic manufacturers that need certain imports. They've caused harms for certain Chinese manufacturers and foreign steel producers and the rest. They have caused investment to shift a little bit out of China due to geopolitical tensions or costs. But overall, in the biggest picture, there really haven't been a lot of major changes. And I think part of that is because what Trump went after, while significant, was just simply not a big enough share of the U.S. economy. The little known fact is that the United States is not nearly as globally integrated and dependent on imports and trade as you think. Right. In fact, we're one of the least globalized countries in terms of share of our economy that has imports and exports. Imports and exports is a share of our economy. So one of the lowest shares in the entire world. We're right around the level of Sudan. That's presumably more just because we're a massive country with a massive economy with oceans. Yeah, so we trade a lot.
We don't need to trade, so to speak, or it's not as efficient in terms of comparative advantage as it is for Switzerland or something.
Exactly, and because so much of our economy is services based.
That's hard.
You can't outsource a mortgage. at least not really. And so those types of things, that type of economic activity is going to stay within U.S. borders. So because of that, and because of just the sheer enormity of the U.S. and Chinese economies, the global economy, global trade flows that are into the trillions and trillions of dollars, we haven't seen any major seismic changes, just little shifts at the margins. But I think the other area, though, where Trump has had an effect is on the institutions. So I think the WTO the World Trade Organization is really, really struggling. I'm hoping that Biden at least restores the ability of the WTO's court, the appellate body, to start functioning again. Trump collapsed it because they wouldn't agree to on appointing new appellate body members. He also, though, revealed just how little power the WTO has over members' protectionist actions, and particularly using national security as the excuse. And so the WTO is in a pretty weak spot, and I think Trump has done some pretty significant. It was already struggling, but I think he just further pushed it into the grave. But outside of the WTO, look, the TPP still exists. It just exists now as the CPTPP, worst name ever, without the United States.
So explain that a little bit. So the TPP was negotiated by the Obama administration with bipartisan support to be a trade agreement with our Asian allies, basically.
Yeah, so with 11 other countries, Japan, Vietnam,
Asian,
Malaysia,
Pacific,
Australia, New Zealand, a few others. And Canada and Mexico as well,
Latin,
they were going to be brought in. So kind of to create, again, if you think of the Asia-Pacific region, kind of a rim of nations, excluding China, due to the rules on state-owned enterprises and industrial subsidies, all the kind of things that we wanted to do at the WTO we couldn't do, we jammed into TPP. And TPP was also going to be used to bring in other countries. So bring in, for example, Thailand into the fold. South Korea, we already have an FTA with them, but we wanted to bring them into it. And other countries to create this kind of new Asia-Pac supply chain that would only include China if China got its act together on all those systemic issues, state capitalism issues that China doesn't want to deal with. Well, so we abandoned that on Trump's first day in office, and instead of just
Hillary abandoned it during the campaign, and having helped negotiate it.
Yeah, and I should
both
note,
parties were against it, which people were really astonished by. I know when I went to Japan in December of 2017, they really thought, oh my God, the U.S., which has been the cornerstone of the gradual increase of free trade and globalization, both parties have turned their back on it. And I tried to reassure them, well, I'm not so sure. This is just one campaign, but I don't know. I mean, this is a big question going forward, right?
And so it is because the Biden administration has been pretty explicit that they don't plan on touching any trade agreements for a while. Now that could again just be domestic political rhetoric. Maybe something changes in the fall, but right now there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in the administration in rejoining. So just to close the loop. So instead of taking their ball and going home, all of the other TPP members got together and finalized the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And they did it by essentially eliminating a lot of the rules that the United States wanted on investor-state dispute settlement, on intellectual property rules, some of the things we demanded, and the agreement's now in force. And so and now other nations are looking to join.
And could we join?
Yeah, we could rejoin. There is an accession process. Japan in particular would love to have us. We have this phase 1 deal with Japan that the Trump administration finished that was essentially implementing some of Japan's TPP commitments. Japan has said that they'd love to be phase 2 to be TPP. That to finish the deal, the United States could fold in to CPTPP. Canada and Mexico would also be very pleased with doing that since they have the USMCA. It's already done. So, but I think the institutional point here is that other countries have moved on without the United States. Meanwhile, China has just completed its own version of TPP, the RCEP, Regional and Comprehensive Economic Partnership. I miss the days when they used to just call these things free trade agreements. It made things a lot easier. Now they have to create all these names, it's all marketing.
Are they mostly still, some people will say, well, they're not free trade agreements, but look, they're 1,300 pages or
no, well,
5,700
so
pages, and it's kind of government regulation of a different sort, etc.
There is some of that. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of trade liberalization in there too. There's a lot of tariff liberalization, services liberalization, I think is a big area. But like any sausage that gets made, you end up throwing in other stuff. And they have, I think, FTAs have been larded down a bit over the years. And I think that's a legitimate criticism of our trade agreements, is that they really, trade is in there, but there's other stuff too. But
they're still basically trade liberalizing.
Yeah, and RCEP is less ambitious than TPP, but it still does liberalize the vast majority of trade in goods between these countries and some services. And why does that matter? Well, again, China, the whole point of TPP is to try to shift the center of gravity for the Asia-Pac region a little bit more towards the United States, understanding that China has a just massive center of gravity given its population and economic growth. So RCEP really, again, shifts that back towards China. And it includes a lot of the same TPP countries. So, that is just a huge, I think, geopolitical and strategic blunder for the United States to be on the outside of both of these agreements. And again, Biden administration not really talking about rejoining. And I think that is a Trump legacy, really being on the outside looking in. If we really think China is the geopolitical challenge of the 21st century, being on the outside of these deals while undermining the World Trade Organization and trying to just go it alone or do these little ad hoc partnerships with Europe or Japan or whatever, it's a mess. It's going to be very, very difficult.
I mean, I was going to ask about that. My national security friends who are hawkish on China, it sounds like actually their policies would dovetail with your policies, if we can call it that, mostly. Now, I suppose they would have some cautions about state-owned enterprises and dependence on China for military things and so forth. But you think we're not going to hit to a huge clash between the national security hawks and the free traders on issues like China?
On regional cooperation, I don't think so. I mean, I think where I'm going to butt heads a little bit is on the imperative to copy China to beat China. On the industrial policy, supply chain renationalization, protectionism, and the rest, that strikes me as pretty wrongheaded, just because it actually hobbles us. I mean, if you look at what Trump's tariffs did, for example, it actually weakened American manufacturing. It discouraged investment because it injected all sorts of uncertainty into the process. And that strikes me as, again, kind of the wrong way to handle China. I think we should lean into what we do well, which is openness to high-skill immigration, openness to trade and investment, global capital, all that kind of good stuff, right? And bringing in, trading more with allies through things like the TPP. I think on that last point, though, I think the hawks and I would get along quite well. But, my view is...
Or discriminating against slave labor goods
Oh,
and
of
so
course.
forth.
Well, and the slave labor, I think we'd all would agree, too. Where I get sheepish on slave labor is when it's really used to just cover all sorts of other protectionism and industrial policy, right? I mean, look, if we have proof, and we do have some proof that there is legitimately slave labor going on in Xinjiang, then, U.S. law already bans imports made from slave labor, and I have no problem with us banning those imports, right? Now, where I start going soft is when you see proposals like Josh Hawley's that want multinationals to map their entire supply chains for potential slave labor, going 2, 3, 4 deep, and not even having to deal with China, having to deal with just slave labor or forced labor as it's defined, which is far broader than slave labor. That's where it's going to create a lot more problems than it solves.
I mean, it does seem to me that we have a history on this, and there is tension. There were, from the Cold War, is what I'm thinking of, from, let's say, the late 40s to the fall of the Soviet Union. We managed to liberalize the global trading system a lot while fighting a Cold War against the Soviet Union.
Right.
Now, there were tensions. There were times when hawks wanted sanctions on the Soviets and the Soviet allies even, and to cut off certain trade because of national security reasons, and sort of more free trade types or business, certainly the business community fought that. So there were moments of discord, but it doesn't seem impossible to ride both those horses at once, a sort of tough national security policy against dictatorships and a liberalizing of trade and globalizing even of economic policy.
Right.
Especially when you're preferring your allies. I mean, that would seem to be a key.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of area for cooperation, and then we can lead the fights for, after we get past the cooperation parts.
Final, so that's interesting. Well, I guess two questions then to end with. Maybe give me your general sense on China. You mentioned quickly that it could be the sort of big geopolitical threat, but what's your general thought about that and China's economic strength or maybe weaknesses over the next 10, 20, 30 years? And then I want to ask just randomly, it occurred to me about Brexit, which seems like a little case study also of a country talking itself into leaving an arrangement which they claimed was bureaucratic and tyranny of Brussels. It really seems, on the other hand, to have been in practice mostly a liberalizing arrangement. Well, I don't know if it was, you tell me. And so where does that, is there a lesson of Brexit? You go in whichever order you want, Brexit or China.
Well, let's start with China. So my view on China is that China presents an immediate short-term threat, but less of a long-term threat. The short-term threats, I think, are pretty clear. Whether it is, technology export restrictions or rare earth minerals, or of course, slave labor in Hong Kong and South China Sea, all of those things strike me as kind of small t threats. I'm actually more optimistic on the big T threat and on the potential for a major clash. Because of two things. One is I think that China has major demographic problems. They are getting very old very quickly before they get rich. That's a cliche saying, but it's very true. They are not opening up to immigration. This is
partly due to the one-child policy of
exactly.
30 years or so, right?
Created all sorts of distortions in their demography that I think are going to have major economic implications, social implications as well, but major economic implications, because China has to maintain a lot of economic growth to maintain social stability, and they need to maintain a lot of economic growth to be a major global player. And I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion that the trend lines we see right now are going to be able to continue. And so demographics, one reason, but the other is Xi is so insistent on getting the state more involved in the economy. This actually makes confident libertarians like me happy, because if you actually look at what's going on in the state sector, state-owned enterprises and the rest, you see that China's productivity gains are dramatically slowing down. You're seeing even more capital misallocation. And so in the heyday of China's economic boom, it was actually smaller private and foreign invested companies that were driving their growth. Kind of the market side of things, while the SOEs kind of lumbered around and belched out a bunch of dirty steel, but they weren't the focus. Well, that's changed, and they're now the focus, and we're seeing the kind of classic results of that in terms of pretty substantial declines in productivity. Well, China's getting old, and they're not allowing immigrants, and they're also having productivity slowdowns. I mean, that kind of shows their economic trajectory is going to flatline at some point.
I mean, from a national security point of view, that could be a very dangerous moment where economic growth slows. They don't see a very happy future by just continuing on a somewhat peaceful and cooperative course, you might say, with a character like Xi in charge. And you can imagine this is where a country lashes out or seeks to divert discontent domestically with by reunifying, taking over Taiwan and carrying out their historic mission. So nationalism does flourish sometimes in these kinds of economic slowdown. And
I will gladly claim humility on the foreign policy, kind of that angle.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I think, but I'm talking.
But I take your point that the standard view of this behemoth that's just going to grow stronger and stronger and bigger is a little could be just off.
Yeah, and it's and the reason that it frustrates me is that because China's economic growth, leaving aside the territorial ambitions and the rest, is the excuse for all sorts of economic meddling in the United States. For example, the most recent National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, included billions of dollars in subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Why? If you listen to all the politicians, it's because of China's semiconductor subsidies. Well, if you actually then look, though, at the efficacy of those semiconductor subsidies in China, it turns out that they've been miserable, that China has spent $50 billion trying to create a global semiconductor champion, and they failed miserably. And that they're a decade behind Intel and even further behind TSMC in Taiwan, the best. So in terms of the China threat on the economic side, necessitating all sorts of U.S. industrial policy, protectionism, and the rest, just strikes me as pretty hollow.
Interesting.
So now on Brexit.
Yeah,
got it. Sorry, I forgot your second question for a second.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're learning quite well just how seamless trade was between the UK and Europe, and just how many barriers to trade exist that aren't tariffs, right? Because the EU-UK agreement still has no tariffs. But the problem is that there are a lot of trade barriers other than tariffs. There's all the paperwork at the borders. There's all sorts of regulatory issues in terms of just the basics of, whether it's food safety and the rest. And that when you remove
freedom of movement of people and
certainly another one. So when you erect these artificial barriers to that, these new political barriers, it creates just massive amounts of friction and uncertainty, and we're seeing that in real time. Think of it this way: it's a lot like trying to put up a border between, say, North and South Carolina, right? All of a sudden now you got to go through a checkpoint, you got to show up, passport, whatever, you have to check your paperwork to get through. You could imagine the snarls on I-95 if you tried to do that, right? Although I'm sure some of my neighbors would appreciate the border. So I think that's one of the things that the Brexiteers didn't really think of when they first went down this road. I think that when it first happened, my thought was, well, I actually very much sympathize with the argument, with the pro-Brexit argument, that the EU has a very sclerotic regulatory system. The EU's system of governance is also very undemocratic and raises all sorts of issues related to accountability. In terms of trade, EU trade agreements have all sorts of carve-outs and the rest. But at the same time, if you're going to leave what has become a fully integrated customs and currency union, you better have a game plan for doing it. And it's clear they didn't. And that's the problem, right? That they didn't really think about just how many things, how many rules, how many requirements they were going to have to figure out in advance of the actual hard Brexit. And they didn't do that, and they're now, suffering through it.
And it strikes me, I remember having this argument with someone from Britain in 2015, 16, and I was somewhat sympathetic, as you were, to some of those arguments against the EU, and also a certain nostalgia for independent Britain and so forth. But I remember saying, but are you sure that, don't you have to take into account the benefits of the last 20, 30 years? You make it seem like accession to the EU and the agreements that Margaret Thatcher made and then the subsequent agreements, I guess, that Major or whoever made, were just a disaster. But I don't know. I visited London recently, and it's pretty, impressive, the economic growth and prosperity there. Now it's not the same in the north of England, and it's sort of like the U.S. You could make an argument that globalization hasn't benefited everyone, but net, compared to where Britain was in 1979, it's a pretty good story, I should think. Again, very much like the U.S. But they, I don't know, more generally, maybe we'll just close with this. how much can one get people to step back and say, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater here, and don't make it seem as if globalization has been some kind of devastating plague that swept over the U.S. and the U.K. Are we serious about going back to either our economic position 30, 40, 50 years ago, or our geopolitical position at a time, before all this integration? I don't know. I mean,
but you hit on it, because the downsides are so obvious. Or the costs of all of this, whether it's a lost job or a mill town, a burnout mill town, or whatever. Those costs are so visible and tangible that it is quite difficult to step back and look at the big picture. And I think we've gotten worse at that over time. And like I said, this is a good closing. I said at the beginning, globalization is spoken of so often as cheap goods. Mm-hmm. Get cheap goods. And I always try to say, look, cheap goods are great. The computer monitor I'm talking to you through right now is a marvel of technology and of a victory of globalization. But there's so much more to it that is unseen, and you don't really feel, but you become accustomed to it, just like people in the UK right now, that they became so accustomed to the benefits, the unseen benefits of globalization, that you really should think twice about throwing a giant monkey wrench in it because of some steel jobs in the industrial Midwest or whatever in that regard, because there is so much more to it that we take, I think, for granted.
Well, think twice would be a good slogan if only some political leaders did it, and encouraged citizens to do it. But of course, we've had so much the opposite. With demagoguery is the opposite of think twice. And I would say in the U.S. context that presidents were particularly the people who said think twice, right? Congressmen represented parochial interests in South Carolina and so forth, but it was the presidents who said, wait a second, we need to do what's right for the country as a whole and for the world as a whole to some degree, and we have to put aside try to handle people's complaints and grievances. But that's where I do think the price one pays for national political leaders being on the demagogue team instead of the think twice team can be pretty considerable, right?
Right. And again, those trade laws I mentioned that had all that discretion baked in, they had the discretion baked in because presidents for decades and decades were the most responsible guy in the room. They were considering the national interest, were considering the geopolitical implications. And again, we kind of have stopped doing that. The presidents have decided they have discrete constituencies that they're going to benefit through any policies that might touch on globalization and the rest. Again, I think, looking at Trump's legacy, I'm really hoping that is not one. It would be good to see a President Biden eventually, after he gets these Buy American stuff out of his system, to think more on the national interest level, like past presidents more or less did.
Scott, let's hope President Biden sees this and gets past some of these minor issues he's dealing with now, and I think he might actually move us forward on all these fronts. And let's hope our political system has a little more thinking twice and a little less demagoguery. So, Scott Lincicome, thank you very much for joining me today on what I think has been a very interesting, I hope, and informative conversation. And thank you all for joining us on Conversations.